The fire roared inside the longhouse, its glow flickering against wooden beams blackened with years of smoke. The hall was alive with laughter, the crash of drinking horns, the heavy scent of roasted meat. At the head of the feast sat the Jarl, a man wrapped in fine furs, his arm ring heavy with silver, his presence commanding. Every eye turned toward him when he lifted his cup. His warriors cheered, his skalds sang his praises, and the hall shook with pride. To an outsider, this was power. To a farmer pressed into service, this was greatness. To a slave crouched in the shadows, this was fear. But what no one said aloud, not even the Jarl himself, was that this moment of triumph was also a moment of danger. Every warrior at the table could be a future rival. Every kinsman could be a traitor. Every feast could be poisoned. Because in the Viking world, power wasn't secure. It wasn't inherited in peace, it wasn't protected by laws, and it wasn't shielded by loyalty. Power was borrowed for as long as you were strong enough to hold it. And the day you faltered, the day you failed to deliver silver, meat, and victories, that power would be torn from you. Being a Jarl wasn't safety. It was a death sentence, delayed only by cunning, wealth, and the loyalty you could buy. The sagas remember the triumphs, but what they don't tell you is that most Jarls didn't die gloriously in battle. They were betrayed, ambushed, poisoned, or cast aside. Tonight, the Jarl raises his cup high. Tomorrow, he may lose his head. Part 1. What it meant to be a Jarl. When we speak of Viking Jarls, we often imagine them as kings ruling from thrones, secure in power, commanding fleets at will. The truth was more fragile, more violent, and far less glamorous. The word Jarl itself didn't mean king. It meant something closer to chieftain, the man at the top of a regional hierarchy, the leader of warriors, the owner of land and slaves, the judge of disputes, the war chief who decided when to raid and when to stay home. A Jarl wasn't an absolute monarch. He was more like the strongest wolf in a restless pack, and wolves always fought to test the leader. To become a Jarl, you needed more than bloodlines. You needed wealth, cunning, charisma, and above all, the respect of men who could just as easily kill you as serve you. And once you gained that position, you carried the heaviest burden imaginable. Every mouth in your territory looked to you for food, silver, and leadership. The farmers needed protection from raids. The warriors needed payment for their loyalty. The thralls needed direction for their labor. The gods themselves demanded sacrifice to show your strength. Fail in any one of these duties, and whispers of weakness spread like wildfire. And weakness was fatal. A Jarl had to sit in judgment over feuds between families, deciding who was right, who was wrong, and how blood money or wergild should be paid. But there was no way to please everyone. Every judgment you made risked creating enemies. Every enemy you made plotted revenge. A Jarl also had to lead in war. If he commanded a raid that failed, if he returned home without treasure or slaves, his men's loyalty would crumble. Warriors didn't follow empty hands, they followed silver. The Jarl who couldn't deliver was the Jarl who wouldn't live long, and the people expected spectacle. A good Jarl gave great feasts. He slaughtered cattle, roasted boars, and poured mead until his men's voices grew hoarse with song. Those feasts weren't just for pleasure, they were a show of power, a declaration that he was strong enough to give, that the gods favored him, that loyalty was rewarded. But food ran out, silver ran out, favor ran out, and when it did, the same men who once cheered your name could sharpen their axes against you. In Viking society, power wasn't inherited with peace. It was fought for, seized, and constantly defended. A Jarl's own kin might turn against him, his most trusted warriors might betray him, and his neighbors always waited for the moment of weakness to strike. What it meant to be a Jarl wasn't security, wasn't wealth, wasn't peace. It was living every day with a blade pressed to your neck unseen, but always there. And history is littered with Jarls who forgot that truth. They ruled too greedily, too carelessly, or too weakly. And when their time came, their end was brutal. Because in the Viking Age, to be a Jarl was to be hunted, not by enemies from afar, but by the people closest to you. Part 2. The constant threat of rival Jarls. If you were a Viking Jarl, the greatest threat to your life wasn't always rebellion inside your longhouse. It often came from the next longhouse over. Neighboring Jarls were not just rivals in politics, they were predators circling the same waters, each one waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. A failed raid, a poor harvest, a lost battle, or even whispers of cowardice could be enough to paint a target on your hall. The Viking world was not a land of clear borders and safe kingdoms. It was fractured into countless small territories, each ruled by its own Jarl or chieftain. Some controlled fertile farmland, others coastal trade routes, others the crucial harbors where ships were built and launched. Every patch of land, every stream, every herd of cattle was worth fighting over. And fight they did. War as politics. To a Viking Jarl, war was not just about plunder, it was about legitimacy. To prove you were worthy of leading, you had to show that you could take from others and defend what was yours. Every raid, whether across the sea or into the next valley, was a gamble. Success meant wealth, slaves, and honor. Failure meant shame, and shame was often fatal. A rival Jarl could use your failure as propaganda, whispering to your warriors, "Why follow a man who cannot win? Why not follow me instead?" These weren't empty threats. History is full of stories where Jarls and kings alike lost everything after a single defeat. In the sagas, a man's fortune was as fragile as the thin planks of the longship that carried him. One crack and the whole structure sank. The endless blood feuds. Then there were feuds bitter, personal wars between Jarls and their families. Unlike raids, these weren't quick strikes for silver. They were long, drawn-out cycles of vengeance, where one killing demanded another, and honor demanded nothing less than blood. A Jarl could find himself locked in a feud that spanned years. He might avenge a brother, only to spark retaliation from a rival clan. He might demand compensation for a slain warrior, only to be mocked with refusal. In such cases, there was no turning back. The feud consumed everything. The Icelandic sagas are filled with these bloody spirals, where a single insult at a feast, a broken marriage promise, or a theft of land set off wars that lasted generations. For Jarls, these feuds weren't optional. To refuse to fight was to admit weakness. And weakness, again, was death. Neighbors turned executioners. Even alliances were dangerous. A neighboring Jarl might swear loyalty, join you on raids, share silver and glory. But the alliance lasted only as long as it benefited him. The moment he saw an opening, he might betray you, striking your lands while your warriors were abroad, or turning your own men against you. Some Jarls forged pacts sealed with marriage daughters and sisters traded as political weapons. But marriage was no guarantee of peace. In fact, it often deepened rivalries. If a marriage turned sour, or if dowries were disputed, entire clans could erupt into war. And if your kin married into another Jarl's family, it only gave him more excuses to meddle in your affairs. One insult to your daughter was suddenly grounds for war. One slight against his son-in-law was suddenly a blood feud. The longhouse became a chessboard of marriages, alliances, and betrayals, and the Jarl was both king and pawn. The price of losing. What happened when a Jarl lost? The answer was brutal. Defeat didn't mean exile with dignity. It meant humiliation, enslavement, or death. Some Jarls were captured and sacrificed to the gods, their deaths a public display of dominance by their conquerors. Others were tortured, executed, or forced to watch their families enslaved. And sometimes the fall was worse than death. A defeated Jarl could be reduced to a thrall, made to serve the very men he once ruled. Imagine the shame a man who once presided over feasts, now chained to labor like cattle. For the Vikings, whose culture prized honor above all else, this was a fate worse than the axe. Historical examples. We don't have to look far in history to see this cutthroat reality. Take the story of Harald Hardrada, the first king of a unified Norway. His rise to power wasn't a peaceful election. It was a brutal process of crushing rival Jarls, one after another. Some he killed outright, others he forced into submission. Many chose exile rather than bow to him, sailing west to Iceland or even farther to escape his grasp. Another example is Jarl Håkon Sigurdsson of Lade, a powerful ruler in the 10th century. He held Norway for years, commanding respect as a warlord. But his end was anything but glorious. When King Olaf Tryggvason rose in power, Håkon's support crumbled. Betrayed by his own thralls, he was strangled to death while hiding in a pigsty. From ruling halls to dying in filth, such was the fate of a fallen Jarl. The permanent state of war. So what did this mean for daily life? It meant that every Jarl lived in a permanent state of war readiness. He had to maintain a fleet of ships, a band of loyal warriors, and a treasury of silver ready to pay them. His longhouse had to be both a hall of feasting and a fortress. Every sunrise could bring a raid. Every feast could end in bloodshed. Every ally could become an enemy. This was the cutthroat reality of Viking politics. If you were a Jarl, you were never safe. You lived by the sword, and you died by it. Part 3. Betrayal within the longhouse. If the life of a Viking Jarl was dangerous because of rival rulers, it was even more perilous because of those closest to him. You could build ships, hire warriors, strike alliances, and crush rivals. But the knife that ended your reign was just as likely to come from someone sitting beside you at the feast. The Viking longhouse was both a symbol of power and a trap. It was where the Jarl held court, feasted with his men, and conducted politics. By day, it echoed with arguments over land, trade, and justice. By night, it roared with drinking, boasting, and promises of loyalty. But loyalty was thin, and promises thinner. The longhouse as a stage for power. The longhouse wasn't just a home, it was a theater of dominance. The Jarl sat at the high seat, flanked by his huscarls, his personal guard, and across from him sat his most trusted warriors and allies. Every seating position mattered, every cup of mead carried meaning. To sit closer to the Jarl was an honor. To be moved farther down the hall was an insult. This constant jockeying for favor bred resentment. A warrior who felt overlooked, a kinsman who felt insulted, a thrall who felt abused, all could become conspirators. The longhouse was supposed to be a fortress of loyalty, but in reality, it was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Ambitious huscarls. Huscarls, the elite bodyguards of a Jarl, were supposed to be the most loyal men alive. They ate at his table, fought by his side, and were rewarded with land, silver, and honor. But loyalty has its limits when ambition whispers. If a Jarl grew weak, or if his silver coffers ran dry, his huscarls might turn against him. A strong warrior could convince others that he would be a better leader. A single night of drunken boasting could plant the idea, why follow this man when we could follow me? There are sagas where Jarls were murdered by their own guards cut down in the very hall they thought was safest. It was the ultimate betrayal, but one that happened often enough that every Jarl feared it. Family as rivals. Even blood could not be trusted. Sons plotted against fathers. Brothers murdered brothers. Wives schemed behind the scenes, manipulating alliances and stirring feuds. For Viking Jarls, family wasn't just kin. It was a network of potential rivals. Every son dreamed of inheriting power. Every brother believed he had just as much right to rule. Every marriage created in-laws who demanded influence. Take the tale of Jarl Håkon Sigurdsson again. His end didn't come from foreign invaders, but from betrayal by his own thralls. Or consider King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who was killed in rebellion led by his own son. In the Viking Age, there was no guarantee that the man sharing your blood wouldn't also one day share your grave. Poison in the cup. One of the darkest realities of Viking politics was the ever-present fear of poison. Feasts were moments of celebration, but they were also the perfect chance for assassination. A poisoned horn of mead, a tainted dish of roasted meat, a Jarl could be undone not by an axe, but by a sip. This fear was so real that some rulers demanded cupbearers taste every drink before it touched their lips. Even then, suspicion never faded. Feasts, meant to display unity and loyalty, often became silent games of paranoia, where every toast might be your last. Wives and the web of influence. Behind the curtain of the longhouse, women held immense power. A Jarl's wife wasn't just a companion, she was a political strategist, an influencer, sometimes even a manipulator. Many sagas depict women urging their husbands toward blood feuds or vengeance, whispering into their ears that to hesitate was to show weakness. Sometimes this led to the Jarl's downfall. A wife might secretly support a rival or even conspire with her own kin to overthrow her husband. The longhouse was full of whispers of insult, betrayal, opportunity. And a Jarl had to sleep every night surrounded by people who had as much to gain from his death as from his life. Part 4. The crushing burden of wealth and power. When we imagine a Viking Jarl, we often picture overflowing treasure chests, ships dripping with stolen silver, and longhouses stocked with rare goods. And that image isn't wrong. Jarls lived richer lives than nearly anyone else in Scandinavia, but that wealth, instead of guaranteeing security, became one of their greatest vulnerabilities. It painted a target on their backs, burdened them with endless responsibilities, and made their position even more precarious. Wealth as a double-edged sword. Silver was the lifeblood of Viking power. A Jarl needed it to pay huscarls, to reward loyal warriors, to fund expeditions, and to buy influence. The more wealth he had, the more men he could attract, and the more respect he commanded. But here's the brutal truth. In the Viking Age, wealth was never permanent. A chest of silver was not something you could lock away and forget. It was fuel, and if you didn't keep burning it, the fire of your power would go out. If a jarl couldn't distribute silver, warriors would abandon him for someone richer. Huscarls who once swore loyalty would pack their shields and leave. To keep his hall full and his armies loyal, a jarl had to keep wealth flowing like blood through a vein. The curse of endless distribution. One of the defining features of Viking leadership was the concept of the ring giver. A true leader didn't hoard treasure. He handed it out silver arm rings, swords, gold torques, even land. The act of giving was proof of his greatness. But this meant a jarl could never relax. Every raid, every trade expedition, every tax collection, all of it had to feed back into this endless cycle of gift giving. If he faltered, his warriors saw it as weakness. Imagine the pressure. After leading a dangerous raid across the North Sea, you bring back silver and slaves. The moment you return, half of it is gone to pay your huscarls. A portion goes to allies, a portion to your wife's family, a portion to rebuild ships, and suddenly the treasure you risked your life for is almost gone. Tomorrow, your warriors demand another raid. The cycle never ends. Envy from below. The wealth of a jarl didn't just attract warriors, it provoked envy from every corner of society. Free farmers saw jarls living in longhouses while they toiled in smoky huts. Lesser chiefs saw jarls feasting with exotic goods while they scraped together enough to host meager gatherings. Even within the jarl's own circle, resentment simmered. Why did he get to rule when others had proven themselves just as brave in battle? Wealth was proof of power, but it also made you a lightning rod. To many, the jarl wasn't just a leader, he was a target whose riches could be claimed if he were struck down. Enemies at every shore. A jarl's wealth wasn't just a problem at home. Abroad, it turned him into prey. If word spread that a jarl had captured immense treasure, rival Vikings, Saxon warlords, or even Norse kinsmen might band together to take it. This is why jarls were rarely safe in their longhouses. Raids weren't just about plundering foreign lands sometimes, they were about plundering each other. The richer you grew, the more likely your fellow Vikings were already sharpening their axes to relieve you of it. The danger of greedy allies. Wealth was also the glue that held alliances together, but it was fragile glue at best. Allied chiefs supported a jarl as long as silver flowed in their direction. But the moment distribution faltered, those allies could turn enemies overnight. This forced jarls into impossible decisions. Do you reward your huscarls more than your allied chiefs? Do you favor your own family, or do you spread wealth to bind others? Every choice bred resentment somewhere, and every resentful man was a potential conspirator. The vulnerability of display. In Viking culture, wealth had to be displayed. A jarl who kept his riches hidden was seen as weak, stingy, even dishonorable. That meant feasts had to overflow with mead, longhouses had to be adorned with carved wood and silver fittings, and clothing had to show off dyed fabrics or foreign imports. But the very act of displaying wealth made a jarl vulnerable. A lavish feast not only drained resources but also reminded every jealous guest just how much there was to gain by killing him. Every gift of silver was both a sign of generosity and an admission. I have what you want, and you may someday try to take it. Part 5. The Jarl's Endless War for Survival. For a Viking Jarl, survival wasn't a passive state. It wasn't about building a strong longhouse and settling into comfort. Survival was war constant, grinding, and unending. The Jarl's life was one long campaign, not just against foreign enemies, but against rivals, allies, his own family, and even his own body. Every single day was a battle to keep the throne beneath him, and the second he let his guard down, someone else was ready to take it. The war never ends. The Viking Age was a world of ceaseless motion. If a Jarl wasn't raiding, he was defending. If he wasn't defending, he was plotting. And if he wasn't plotting, he was the one being plotted against. For the free farmers and thralls of his domain, survival meant enduring the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, storing food for winter. But for a Jarl, there was no cycle of peace. There was only the endless churn of ambition and violence. Because unlike a farmer, he could never afford to simply survive. He had to dominate. The second he stopped expanding his influence, his rivals would move in like wolves scenting blood. Season of raids, season of risk. Summer meant raiding season. The longships would be prepared, huscarls gathered, alliances negotiated, and silver promised. To refuse to raid to stay home while others sought glory and treasure was unthinkable. It wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was suicide for a Jarl's reputation. Warriors demanded adventure and plunder. Without it, they would abandon him. So even if seas were rough, even if alliances were shaky, the Jarl had to sail. Each summer was a gamble with his life. But raiding wasn't guaranteed glory. A storm could scatter ships, a miscalculated attack could end in slaughter, an ambush could cost him half his men, and every failure, even those caused by fate, weakened his position back home. A Jarl who returned empty-handed wasn't pitied. He was despised. He had promised silver and glory and delivered nothing. That shame was enough to unravel everything he had built. The winter trap. And then came winter. Long, brutal, silent. Unlike farmers who retreated into smoky huts to survive the dark months, Jarls entered a different kind of warfare. Political survival. Winter was the season of feasts, diplomacy, and scheming. A Jarl had to host lavish gatherings to prove his wealth. He had to smooth over disputes between allies, plan the next summer's raids, and prepare for betrayals. Winter wasn't rest. It was pressure, condensed into endless nights where every whispered word could mean death. A single insult at a feast could spiral into a blood feud. A single drunken boast could draw unwanted enemies. And all the while, the Jarl had to show strength, generosity, and control, even if his treasury was nearly empty from the last raid. The constant threat of assassination. Life as a Jarl wasn't only threatened on the battlefield. In fact, the deadliest strikes often came in silence. Poisoned cups of mead, daggers in the dark, ambushes along forest paths. Jarls lived with the constant knowledge that their death might come not from an enemy army, but from the man sitting beside them at the feast. Bodyguards, huscarls, and family members were supposed to protect him. But often they were the ones plotting betrayal. It's no accident that Viking sagas are filled with tales of murder and treachery. These weren't just stories for entertainment, they were reflections of the brutal truth. No Jarl could truly trust anyone. The war within the family. Perhaps the cruelest war of all was fought inside the Jarl's own hall. His sons wanted his throne, his brothers wanted his lands, his wife's family wanted greater influence. Daughters became pawns in alliances, married off to bind families, and sometimes those very alliances turned against him. A Jarl had to keep his children fed with wealth and titles, but not so much that they became threats. He had to reward brothers enough to keep them loyal, but not enough to empower them to challenge him. His household was a battlefield, quieter than the sea raids, but often deadlier. The burden of honor. And through it all, there was honor. A Jarl couldn't just be cunning. He had to be bold, generous, fearless, and ruthless all at once. If he acted too cautious, he was weak. If he was too reckless, he was a fool. If he was too stingy, he was despised. If he gave too much, he bankrupted himself. It was a balancing act with no margin for error. And even if he succeeded for years, one mistake, one bad raid, one betrayal, one failed feast could undo everything. The toll on the man. Imagine the toll this took. Always smiling at the feast, always plotting in private, always riding to war, always fearing betrayal. Sleep was shallow, meals uneasy, trust non-existent. Jarls didn't just carry swords into battle, they carried the crushing weight of paranoia, anxiety, and constant fear. And when they finally fell, whether on the battlefield or in their own hall, their enemies didn't mourn. They feasted on their downfall. The high seat of doom. Being a Viking Jarl was no triumph. It was a death sentence, delayed only by cunning, strength, and luck. Yes, Jarls sat in the high seat at the feast. They wore the finest cloaks, commanded the fiercest warriors, and held the richest treasures. But those treasures were cursed, those warriors restless, that high seat drenched in blood. To the outside world, they were kings. To themselves, they were prey hunted by rivals, betrayed by allies, and haunted by their own families. Their lives were a constant test, one they could never truly win. This is the brutal truth. Life as a Viking Jarl wasn't a reward. It was a cage, built of silver and blood. Every feast was a gamble, every alliance a ticking clock, every smile a mask hiding suspicion. And in the end, most Jarls didn't die in glory. They died in betrayal, their heads taken by men who once raised their cups in loyalty. So the next time you picture a Viking Jarl seated on a carved throne, his longhouse blazing with firelight, his warriors singing his name, remember this: you wouldn't envy him if you truly understood. His wealth was a burden, his power a curse, his life a nightmare. Because life as a Viking Jarl was so cutthroat, you'd lose your head.